Another spicy topic coming right after the Legend of Zelda 35th anniversary. I mean, the whole point of these sorts of videos is just to sort of expand your mind, to discuss things, to talk about things going on. There's some weird theory out there that I hate Metroid or something like that, but I probably own more Metroid games than you. Metroid Prime Hunters on the Nintendo DS is my most played game of all time. And yes, I have picked up 2 copies of Metroid Dread. I picked up the Collector's Edition to add to my collection, and I will be picking up a digital edition of the game in order to play the game. So I love the Metroid series, but of course with the announcement of Metroid Dread during Nintendo's E3 2021 presentation, there has since been a lot of discussion over the price of the game, a $60 2D Metroid game, which is something we've alluded to before on the channel. So in today's video, I just want to talk about why people feel this way, sort of get into the psychology of it, talk about the Metroid Dread game itself, and then talk about something that I don't think a lot of people are factoring in when they talk about the $60 price point with Metroid. So if this is your first time on the channel, be sure to hit that subscribe button and be sure to like the video. But without any further ado, let's talk about the $60 question with Metroid Dread for the Nintendo Switch. So in case you've been living under a rock, Metroid Dread was announced for the Nintendo Switch during Nintendo's E3 presentation, a brand new 2D Metroid game, something that hasn't been a thing in, well, 19 years. Sure, there's been some remakes here and there. Of course, we got Samus Returns on the Nintendo 3DS, but as far as a brand new 2D Metroid game with a brand new story and all that, this is the first time we have seen that in 19 years. Now, Metroid Dread itself has a very interesting history because originally this was supposed to be a 2D Metroid game that was available for the Nintendo DS. So we're talking 15 plus years that this game has been a thought in Nintendo's mind, really playing the long game with Metroid Dread. Now, going back into history with the Metroid series, you would know that it was probably at its most popular around that time, the mid-2000s. You, of course, had a bunch of different Metroid games that were releasing across a bunch of different Nintendo systems. The Metroid Prime series was out on the GameCube, and it really sort of reinvented the Metroid game as a whole, you know, a first-person adventure game instead of a standard 2D scrolling game that we, of course, had seen in years past. But that doesn't mean that classic games weren't also being made for Metroid. Of course, on the Game Boy Advance, you had Metroid Fusion and Metroid Zero Mission, which were more traditional 2D Metroid games. So it was a very interesting time for the Metroid franchise. Even on the Nintendo DS, you had Metroid Prime Pinball, you had Metroid Prime Hunters, so there was a lot of Metroid stuff going on around this time, and it was obviously the peak of the franchise, especially coming after the fact that the N64 did not have any Metroid games. But then Metroid just kind of got into a weird state with the whole franchise because Nintendo seemed to get a bit sour on the franchise almost. They just essentially stopped making Metroid games. You had a few here and there. Of course, on the Nintendo Wii, there were some Metroid games with Metroid Prime 3 Corruption and Metroid Other M, which was a bit of a divisive game. Of course, it was a 2.5D game made by Koei Tecmo, or Tecmo at the time. Of course, you also had some 3DS games, but the whole franchise of Metroid just kind of went away. And a lot of people couldn't really understand why. Why were there no more 2D Metroid games like we had seen in previous years on the handheld consoles? Now, of course, we did get a remake of a Metroid game with a 2D Metroid for Metroid Samus Returns on the Nintendo 3DS, but that came out at the tail end of the system's life cycle, and we'll talk a bit more about that game as the video goes on. But obviously, Nintendo, for some reason, got a bit sour on the Metroid franchise. Now, there's a lot of things you can do with Metroid games, but the fact of the matter is, for a lot of people, the Metroid franchise became sort of an indie staple. The whole Metroidvania thing, the whole 2D game where you have to find different power-ups in order to access different areas of the game. And I feel like that's really one of the first points when talking about a $60 2D Metroid game in 2021, is you have to look at the indie side of things. Now, in those 19 plus years since we've gotten a brand new 2D Metroid game, like I said, the Metroidvania franchise has really popped off, and you have so many indie developers and so many indie games out there that essentially use this sort of style of gameplay. Some of the highlights from this are, of course, games like Hollow Knight, games like the Ori series, and one that I feel is very underrated is a game like Shadow Complex, which originally came out on the PlayStation 3 and the Xbox 360, and then it was available also on the PlayStation 4 as well with a remastered edition of the game. But essentially, these were Metroid-style games where you're playing a 2D game in which you have to find various power-ups in order to access various areas to get further into the game and progress into the game. But all these games, of course, are $30 or less. You haven't seen a Metroidvania game come out at a full price with a 2D Metroidvania style game for these $60, and that's kind of where a lot of people get weird about this game. Now, like I said, I'm looking forward to Metroid Dread. I'm picking up 2 copies of the game, the collector's edition and a digital edition for me to play. But I do want to sort of pose a question to you guys that I think will sort of make you see why some people are questioning the $60 price tag with this game. Looking at the game that we saw, looking at the gameplay that we saw during the trailer, and then the subsequent Treehouse stuff, if you were to remove Samus from this equation, if you were to remove Samus's story and the Metroid story from this equation, and just put in a random character or a new character, would you be willing to pay a $60 price point for what you saw with a character that was not Samus, that this was not a Metroid game, it was just yet another Metroidvania indie game? And I think that's a very interesting question, because I feel like the Metroid name and the Samus name and the lore behind this is pretty much what's driving this to be a $60 game. Now, for fans of Metroid, that's a no-brainer. You want to buy anything Metroid related, you want to see anything Metroid related be very successful so that we get more Metroid stuff. But for the more casual gamer who's maybe not familiar with the Metroid franchise because it's been so long since there have been really new games in the franchise, would this be enough to compel you to say, hey, this game looks like a $60 game? To me personally, I don't care. Like I said, I've already bought it and I'm buying a digital copy, but I could definitely understand why some people feel that way, especially considering the amount of indie 2D Metroidvania games that are currently on the market, that have been saturating the market for the past 5+ years. Is the appeal of Samus and the appeal of that Metroid brand enough for people to want to get invested in this game? But really, to me, one of the biggest things with this whole debate about Metroid Dread being a $60 game, I think subconsciously comes down to Nintendo fans wanting this game to succeed very well, because let's be realistic here, the Metroid series does not sell well, and people get very mad at me when I say this, but it's factual. It's actually based on data, and when you look at the data for Metroid game sales, it's not very impressive, and the Metroid franchise definitely needs something to propel it, to show Nintendo, hey, people are looking forward to Metroid games, they love Metroid games, and they want more Metroid games. The highest selling Metroid game of all time was Metroid Prime on the GameCube, which came in at about 2.84 million units, which honestly is pretty impressive when you consider that the Nintendo GameCube didn't have huge sales or anything like that when it came to system sales. So the tie-in rate for that game was very impressive. But looking at the 2D Metroid side of things, you have to go back to the original Metroid being the most successful 2D Metroid that Nintendo ever released back in 1986 for the NES and the Famicom, coming in at about 2.73 million units. Now, the last game that released in a 2D Metroid style was, of course, Metroid Samus Returns, a remake of the original Metroid 2 on the Game Boy, and this game managed to sell under 1 million units. It barely broke 500,000 units sold, and a lot of people say, oh, well, it's because the Nintendo 3DS was at the end of its life cycle, blah, blah, blah. People had made the switch over to the Nintendo Switch, no pun intended, but still, on a system that has a 70 million install base, on a system that actually would be beneficial to have a Metroid game, a 2D Metroid game at only $40, mind you, this game did not manage to break 1 million units sold. And then you have a large contingency of people that say, well, the Nintendo Switch has a crazy attachment rate when it comes to games, and you would be 100% correct. Look at games like Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, Animal Crossing. These games are some of the biggest selling games of all time, and they're on the Nintendo Switch, but I feel like those games are a bit more casual once you start to look at the more hardcore franchises, because let's be realistic, the Metroid franchise does not have that same value and appeal to a lot of people like The Legend of Zelda or a Mario game. I think one thing that a lot of people are picking up is Fire Emblem. Fire Emblem Three Houses managed to sell over 3 million copies on the Nintendo Switch so far that we know about as far as reported data is concerned, which is very good for a more niche Nintendo franchise. So people expect Metroid to be able to do that plus a lot more. People are thinking that this game could sell 5, 6, 7 million units with ease. But I think one thing that a lot of people are forgetting is when you look at Japanese sales for Metroid, since the Famicom version of the game, no version of Metroid has sold over 1 million units in Japan. Japan doesn't really care about the Metroid franchise, and you can't say the same thing about Fire Emblem, because Fire Emblem pretty much got its start and gained its relevancy in Japan. So when you have to factor in that these will all be Western sales for Metroid, I think it becomes a bit of an interesting question of the success of this game. If this game only manages to sell 1.5 or 2 million copies in a year, does Nintendo really have that same good feeling about this game like they would another game and want to make more Metroid games? So I think one of the things is a lot of these diehard Metroid fans want this game to be as successful as possible to show a message to Nintendo. But when you look at statistics and when you look at data for previous things, even the handheld games that of course released on systems that sold 70, 80 million units plus, to see that these games didn't really move the needle in terms of sales, and of course were only available for $40 versus the $60 price point, I think it is something worth mentioning when you're talking about the $60 question with Metroid Dread. But really, at the end of the day, value is a very subjective thing. One man's trash is another man's treasure. Something might be worth $100 to you, it might be worth $5 to someone else. It really just boils down to you as an individual. Like I said, Metroid Dread to me is definitely worth the $60. I mean, I'm paying what, $150 to buy 2 versions of the game because I'm looking forward to this game. I just sort of want to give you guys some sort of alternative thinking with this and sort of give you guys a reason as to why this has become a debate, because it seems like if you even question Metroid Dread being a $60 game on social media, like people come out with pitchforks and try to stab you. I'm trying to give you guys a bigger, broader picture of why this is even a discussion. And really, at the end of the day, it just matters what you think. If you think it's worth a $60 price tag, then you will buy the game for $60. If you don't think it's worth the $60 price tag, you'll probably wait to get it at a cheaper price, or maybe trade in some games to your local GameStop and get it that way. I just thought it was a very interesting discussion, and I'm sure the comment section will be very interesting in this video as well. So let me know what you think of the $60 question with Metroid Dread. Is this game worth $60 to you? Can you understand why, if it is worth $60 to you, why people can feel like, hey, you know what, maybe this isn't a $60 game? And as always, folks, thank you for checking out this video. Like I said at the start, if you are new to the channel, be sure to hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, like the video, all that good YouTube crap. And as always, I will catch you guys on the next video. Later.